I want to thank everyone today for joining us. I am joined today by Jill Wilk with Payentry. Jill, if you wanted to introduce yourself briefly, that would be great.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jill Wilk, and I am the VP of HR Services for Payentry, which is a payroll provider.
Great. Thanks, Jill. She will be speaking second today. I'm just going to do a little matter of housekeeping. During this webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button that is included with this webinar, and we will address those questions after our presentations. We're trying to keep as much time open as possible at the end of this for that to occur. So with that being said, I will begin my portion. And I'm going to be talking about virtual distancing and essentially the number of protections between your remote system and a corporate network. But first, a little bit about myself. I have over 25 years of IT experience. I have started doing consulting in 2005 and started Renaissance in 2010. Over the years, we've kind of become a more next generation managed service provider. We've used a number of processes and techniques to have these remote from home discussions with our clients for a couple of years. And we were able to get all of our clients up and running within, for the most part, a day of the lockdown here in California. And so now I'm acting as a resource for other businesses to make sure that they are covered with these unsure times. So first part of this is teaching people about virtual distancing. And it's essentially a term used to have a number of layers between your employee systems and your corporate network as much as possible. We're seeing that cyber attacks are on the rise because many IT companies are not setting up technology correctly. They're setting it up quickly as opposed to secure. One way that they are doing this is with ransomware, phishing attacks, those types of things. So we are making sure that we check those vectors for both our clients and for other businesses that may be concerned. I do get the question quite a bit of why do cyber criminals do this? The simple answer is because they make a lot of money off of it. There was a study done by Atlas VPN and reported on Tech Republic earlier this year that just from ransomware alone, cyber attackers made $1.5 trillion of revenue last year. And just to put it into context, that is more than the combined revenues of Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and Tesla combined. So it's definitely a huge industry and why it continues to run rampant. So one of these things that is going on right now is with cyber attacks, they are targeting heavily with the COVID crisis. On this screen on the left, you'll see that this is an actual resource center by Johns Hopkins that shows the current confirmed cases and gives reports. On the right was a malicious piece of software that someone could install that, yes, it looks very similar to what is on the left, but in the background, it is installing malware on your computer to then either launch an attack, gather information, try to look for credentials that you're using to log into either email, your servers, financial sites, places like that. So be very careful. There are many phishing attacks, many email attachments that are going out that are trying to build off of this hysteria or this crisis, and just be sure that you are aware of those. Now, as far as questions to ask your current provider to see if you are engaged in proper virtual distancing, the first one is remote connection security. Are you using a VPN, virtual private network, to connect to your corporate network? Are you using something like two-factor authentication when you are logging into your email? These are some of the best ways of securing yourself. And one way to look at this is, if you don't know, if you are logging into, say, a server directly and you're only using a login once, you may have an insecure connection. If you're not using two-factor authentication, if you are logging into, say, Office 365 or G Suite, Google Suite, you may not be secure enough in this time and age. And so what I like to compare this to is a house. If you have a secure house, when you go in, you have to essentially authenticate that it's you going inside your house. You have a lock that you unlock. You may have an alarm system that you have to enter a code. You may have to turn off a camera. Those are ways of having those protections in place. What many IT companies and providers are doing is they weren't ready for this, and as a result, they just set things up quickly and in essence just opened up a window to your house. Yes, it allows you to get into your house a lot easier, but then it allows anybody else who's walking by to get into those ports that are easily accessible or the open window to your house. So that's one thing to check. The second way is remote device security. And from what it looks like on our poll is that we are kind of, more people are using work systems at home. There's a few people using personal systems. So make sure that if you're using personal systems at an offsite location for employees, that they have proper protections in place and that they're just not having access to your network, whether they're using a virtual private network or not, to access your resources, because that will also be a vector in for an attack. And one other thing of concern that's not technology based is, in this change, make sure that your computer use agreements are up to date for people who might be using personal devices at home. If you have to let an employee go and they're working remotely, there is consideration of how do you get the data that belongs to you off that system. The last thing you need is to come back from this whole situation back to an office and have to face litigation because you wiped something that was personal related and didn't give an employee a heads up notice. So that's something to consider as well. And then the third thing to consider is data security and business continuity. How quickly can you get back in business if something were to happen to your on-site network? We talk about return time to operation, that if something were to happen, how quickly do you need to be back up with access to your data, access to your resources? I like to make sure that with the businesses that I work with, that we have both an on-site and an off-site backup, and that those are also protected against ransomware, because the newer types of ransomware can actually go after backups and encrypt backups, and that's where people are faltering and businesses are faltering, is that they do have backups, but then those get taken out as well. There is technology out there that will lock down ransomware if it starts noticing it being affected on those backups. The other thing to consider is, not only are we dealing with work from home, but what if there's a disaster at your on-site location? There was just an earthquake, 6.5 earthquake in Idaho, of all places, last week. And if the building crumbles or you can't get access to it, how are you going to continue to work? There are ways of turning on off-site backups so that people can work on a cloud environment, effectively working on a server that was backed up remotely until the time can pass for the server to be rebuilt on site. So with that being said, I want to offer, if you have questions, if you have any potential needs, we are here as a resource. And I sent out a new question as well. And what we can offer to you is, we can see and talk to you about, are you set up remotely correctly? Do you have proper virtual private networks going on? Do you have two-factor authentication turned on? We can also look at blacklists for you. Many times there can be an attack that you're not aware of, and it's sending out malicious email. And what can happen is that your domain, your email addresses can be blacklisted. And what that means is then spam filters of clients, customers, others that you're trying to send to will bounce. And you may not even realize that you're part of a blacklist. We can do security awareness training, both on phishing, things like I talked about before with the coronavirus emails and malicious attachments. We can train and test employees to make sure that they're not falling victim to this and potentially bringing your company down with you. Port scans, like I said with open windows, we can see if you have any open windows potentially into your corporate network and report those to you. We can go over backup and recovery plans, return time to operation, making sure that you've got a backup system that is resilient enough to meet your return time to operation needs, and also, if need be, to spin something up in the cloud faster if it has to happen. We will also do dark web scans. We can see if your domain, if your business has been part of data breaches, whether it's something maybe from, I know Marriott just had one that happened, or if someone's credentials may have been stolen and are being sold on the dark web. We can help you with that in seeing if those are out there, so that way you can take appropriate action. So those are ways that we can help, and it looks like that we do have a variety of things in place, which is great. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And you can find me at Kirk at renitconsulting.com. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Jill.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining this webinar, and my thanks to Kurt for inviting me. So I am going to go over, if you want to move to the next slide, I'm going to go over the PPP, we call it, the Paycheck Protection Program loan. And I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of these loans, what is involved in these loans, what is included in these loans, and making sure that you know what to do. So the purpose of these loans, the PPP loans, is to cover payroll costs, including benefits that are paid out while your employees are continuing to work. It also includes any kind of rent, any lease agreements that must be enforced before February 15th of 2020. It also includes interest on any mortgage obligations, again, incurred before February 15th. And also any utilities in which the service began before February 15th. So in terms of the payroll costs, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. The payroll costs include any salary, wages, commissions, any tips, and the employee benefits include costs for any kind of payout, excluding the payout that is the emergency paid sick leave, which is the first 2 weeks or up to 80 hours of the paid leave. The payroll costs also include, as I said, employee benefits, any payments required for provision of group healthcare benefits, including premiums, any payment of retirement benefits. In addition to that, any state and local taxes assessed on compensation. So in terms of the loan amounts are based on the on the formula, which is the average monthly payroll costs during the prior year times 2.5 or a maximum of $10 million. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at, again, 2 months of your average payroll cost. And we have had questions about seasonal companies. We want for seasonal companies, for employers to look at the months during the season that we're assessing. So on these loans, the interest rate is 1% fixed, and the loan is due back in 2 years. There is no prepayment penalty to pay it off early, though. Then there is a question about how much of this loan will be forgiven. So if you owe money when your loan is due, if you use the entire amount for anything other than payroll costs or mortgage or rent or any of those that I've outlined earlier. The federal government will forgive the loans equal to the amount of the qualified expenses, which we just mentioned, during the 8-week period following when you get the loan. So again, those qualified expenses include the payroll cost, and I will mention that the payroll costs exclude wages over $100,000 per employee. And I will also mention that the interest on these loans, secured debt obligations, rent, and utilities, again, in place prior to February 1st of 2020. You go to the next slide. So the other program that is available is the Employee Retention Tax Credit. So this is an alternative to the Payroll Protection Program loan. If you are applying for the Payroll Protection Program loan, you cannot have the Employee Retention Tax Credit. It's one or the other. So this program is available for businesses, again, receiving that are where people are not able to work because the business is closed, and it's available to employers whose operations are either fully or partially suspended during this time. And the gross receipts have declined by more than half over the same quarter of the prior year. So this, rather than a loan, provides tax credits for these eligible employers of 50% of the wages paid during the COVID-19 crisis. We have been getting quite a few questions about if employees are laid off, can you receive this retention credit? So the answer is that this retention credit is in place so that you can continue to pay your employees during this crisis. So technically they would still be employees. So this applies to wages paid between March 13th and December 31st of this year. And the tax credit is on the first $10,000 of wages. But this can also include the cost of continuing to pay their health insurance. And what it does exclude, though, is any amount that you've received tax credits for under the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act or the Emergency Paid Sick Leave. So you may be familiar with the Emergency Paid Sick Leave. That is during, again, the first 2 weeks when an employee is at home due to a shutdown. So that has its own tax credit, this kicks in after that. You will definitely want to check with your payroll provider because there are specific codes that are set up in every payroll system, and payroll systems right now are working around the clock to get these codes built, because what these codes will do will enable you to track all of the emergency paid sick leave or emergency family medical leave act time in the payroll system, and will automatically deduct the amount of tax owed so that you essentially get that tax credit. So be sure to check with your payroll provider so that you can make sure that you're tracking it correctly, and so that you are getting the tax credit. The other program that I will point out is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. This is for employees who are filing for unemployment. Again, if your employees, if you have had to completely shut down your business and terminate your employees due to that, they will most likely be filing for unemployment. If they are filing for unemployment, then they would not be paid with the payroll protection loan, because they would not be employees anymore. So this expands unemployment assistance through the end of this year, and the unemployment benefit is what the state benefit is, plus an additional $600 until the end of July. And they've expanded the normal unemployment assistance is 26 weeks. They've now expanded that to 39 weeks. So any of the eligible employees include anyone who's been diagnosed with any symptoms, anyone, the member of their household has been diagnosed with some because of COVID-19 symptoms. They're caring for anyone in the family who's diagnosed, or their school that their child goes to, or daycare is closed, or they're quarantined, which most of us are in that situation now, or again, the individual's place of business is closed as a result of these regulations. The other, which I will include, is that this now applies to self-employed, which normally were never covered under the unemployment insurance. So that is all that I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have regarding that.
Great. Thank you, Jill. I am looking at the attendees and seeing if there is any questions that anyone has. One that I always like to ask, especially when having someone like an HR expert here, is could you define what the difference is between a furlough and someone who is putting up for unemployment or is let go?
Yeah, that is definitely a question that we get quite a bit, and a furloughed employee is someone that you intend to bring back. So many of our clients are schools, actually, and so they on a regular basis will furlough their employees with the intent to bring them back. In some cases, those employees are continued to be employees, and if they are continued to be paid with a contract, then they would not be filing for unemployment. They would instead be part of the payroll protection program loan if that were applied for, or the retention credit. A laid off employee Again, if they are filing for unemployment, then they are not part of the payroll protection loan. So it's one or the other.
And then my other question is, from this crisis and with the laws changing, what is maybe the biggest takeaway that someone can take from this webinar from an HR perspective that you can either say don't do or do this, or make sure of this as a result from an HR perspective?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, one thing that I think is really key, which really ties into your presentation, has to do with the management of remote workers. And I'm actually doing a webinar on that shortly after this. But that is a whole new challenge in terms of managing for accountability with work teams and morale and communications. I think that one thing that is that I look at as the biggest takeaway is for managers to really stretch themselves in terms of communicating with their workforce, even over communicating, to ensure that there's a two-way channel between the managers and employees to make sure that all expectations are outlined, that communication lines are always open, and that employees have a clear direction on what the objectives are. One thing that I cannot stress enough is that when people do not have clear direction from an HR perspective, they'll create a sense of chaos. And there's already a sense of chaos going on in the world right now, and employers do not need that within the workforce. So I would say taking away from this experience to make sure that managers really increase the amount of communication, uh, define clear objectives and expectations, and the third thing, being flexible. That's really important in these times, being flexible, but still holding your employees to be accountable.
I know that from a tech perspective, I've been approached by businesses asking about monitoring of employees to make sure that they're doing work. And I know that that becomes a very nebulous gray area because of consent, because of having them aware that you are monitoring, and especially if people are using their personal systems, that can become a quagmire of legality amongst other things.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And one thing I would add, which is really pertinent to what you just mentioned, is make sure that your handbooks are updated now or when this is over to include any policies that relate to monitoring of work systems. So many many handbooks already include this language. So when an employee signs off on their handbook, they're already signing off to the fact that these are company systems and used for company business, and that they're subject to search at any time. But the legality of these agreements needs to be reviewed definitely on an annual basis as the laws change very frequently. So I would really encourage anyone to make sure they have a handbook and make sure it's current and updated. And if you're planning on monitoring your employees, make sure that if you don't have that agreement in place, make sure that that is put in place.
Great. You'll keep this open for a couple more questions if anyone has any. While waiting, I do want to mention that I'm holding these webinars on almost a weekly basis. I do have upcoming ones with insurance experts, with life insurance, both for business and personal. I know that that's a big topic, especially now with a pandemic around. People are having quite a few questions on that, so that is an upcoming webinar. My content will be changing as well. in the upcoming week or two. So just because this webinar may be similar with my content from the last one, that will be changing. But again, I do appreciate everyone who attended, and I will be posting this up on YouTube as well for those that were not able to attend. And I appreciate Jill's time and expertise for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Kirk. And if anyone has any questions for me after my contact information is on this presentation, feel free to reach out to me. If you have further questions, I'm happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Jill.